You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Rob Webster. I'm an Associate Professor here at the IOE. On this episode, we're talking with Dr. Jennie Golding. Jennie is an Associate Professor of Maths Education at the IOE. She's a maths teacher, but now works across the worlds of education policy, practice and research to support maths education. Jennie's research focuses on initial and continuing teacher development in the UK and internationally. She's interested in addressing questions of what is needed to teach maths effectively in different contexts. Jennie is one of the editors of the Knowledge and the Curriculum series, which is published by UCL Press. We're going to chat to Jennie today about her career in maths education and what the maths curriculum of the future should look like. Jennie, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Rob.
Jennie, let's start with you and your background first of all. So what in your background has led to an interest in knowledge and the curriculum?
Well, thinking back, it's kind of long-standing. So I'm a pure mathematician by background. I mean, that's really nerdy, isn't it? And then went into teaching because I wanted another dimension, I think, and I wasn't ever going to be kind of world-class in pure maths. But because I'm very maths aware, I think from the beginning of my teaching, I wrestled with issues of the relationship between my own knowledge as a mathematician and the sorts of knowledge that I was targeting for teenagers in the classroom. And then any teacher will identify with this, the being faced with the fact that your own university knowledge is really nowhere near enough for what you need in the curriculum. So I wrestled with ideas of what it was that I needed as a teacher that I could bring to make this classroom work. And that's much, much wider than maths because you've got whole young people there. And I think through my career, I've been very conscious of the fact that we're educating whole young people, not just learners in maths classrooms. And that needs an understanding of really complex webs of knowledge in the classroom. So both what you need to bring as a teacher, but what the young people in your classroom are already bringing and where you're trying to support them in getting. That sounds really abstract, but they're ideas that I've found interesting, I think, throughout my career.
Could you give us an example of what that might look like in the maths classroom?
In the maths classroom, you plan for the maths that you're going to be working with during the lesson, but you also plan for the individuals that you're teaching, and it might be a group of 14-year-olds who will be coming in from lunchtime and who have particular relationships and who will arrive in your lesson with particular baggage because they're teenagers and they're individuals. And as a teacher, you're setting out both to mould those into a creative kind of learning community in your classroom, but also to shape the progress of those young people as they mature and begin to look outwards from school.
And is there anything that's perhaps unique to maths, do you think, in this respect? You mentioned teenagers there and coming in with baggage. Is there anything around that, do you think, is quite particular to maths learning?
Well, yes, obviously there is something that's particular because a big chunk of your targeting is maths rather than history or English or French. So those things that I've talked about really are generic. I think there probably are things about maths in that the nature of the subject leads to particular challenges, sometimes frustrations, but also satisfactions. So it's quite a hierarchical subject in itself. That's part of the nature of the subject. And that means if you miss building blocks, it can be very frustrating. It's less right and wrong than often appears, but there is an element of that, and that can be threatening, particularly if you're a teenager. Teenagers are not mature beings, and they can feel quite easily threatened by such things.
Jenny, you mentioned creativity just a moment ago. Are you able to challenge the notion that maths is not a creative subject?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes. It's strange, isn't it? I think there is a public perception that maths is at one end of the spectrum and the creative subjects are at the other. But actually, maths is not fixed and it's not black and white. And I think one of the things that we've learnt over my career, which now goes back, I suppose, 45-ish sort of years, is that we can build classrooms where young people come to appreciate the empowerment that maths can give them, and that they can be owners of it, and they can work out their own approaches to mathematical challenges within a framework that keeps them being able to communicate with the mathematical community. So there are agreed ways of communicating mathematically. When we write down an equation, we mean something. It's a clue to a number. But if you understand it as being a clue to a number, and the object of the exercise is to find what number or numbers fit. And it would be good if we could find a way of doing that that doesn't take too much effort, and that preferably we can use again in another situation, because it's much less work like that and more efficient and more satisfying. Then the whole thing becomes much more of a human activity. And that idea of mathematics as a human activity that is part of our cultural heritage is one that is really powerful for young people, and for young people from early primary onwards. Mathematics is not per se something that's dreamt up to torture you in classrooms. It's something that we have developed because we find a need for it in our lives for practical purposes, but also for playing purposes and for pattern and satisfaction purposes as well. So it's a tool that we bring to our internal and external worlds.
Let's widen the canvas a little bit and talk about the purposes of education. So can you relate some of that of what you've just said to the purposes of education?
So Gert Biester has an analysis of the purposes of education that I really like. So he talks about qualifications. So education needs to lead to the acquisition of knowledge and skills and dispositions, inclinations to engage with meaningful activity that uses those. Education needs to lead to socialization. So we are social creatures. Young people have a need to be inducted into cultural norms, professional norms, ways of being and doing. Unfortunately, what we do in a classroom is not just what we do consciously. We only too easily reproduce the less satisfactory aspects of our society. But anyway, there's the socialization aspect of education. And there's what Biesta calls subjectification, which is the process of coming into being a human subject with initiative and responsibility, as opposed to just an object of the actions of others. So the full formation of the human being from the kind of embryonic state that goes to school in primary school and goes through the teenage years and comes out as a fairly formed sort of member of society. So those things, the qualification, the socialisation, the subjectification. And as a maths educator, I think maths has something to offer to all of those, but not on its own. So other curriculum subjects have different things to offer to each of those, but education is wider than the sum of those. It's more than the sum of those. So as a teacher, you are a role model for better or worse, as it were. The communities that you support the creation of in your classroom are really influential on young people's development. And you know that as a parent. Somebody else has a very big influence on your youngsters. And that's a tremendous responsibility, but also a privilege. And it's also really exciting. And one of the brilliant things about teaching is that you can have a career of 35 years in the classroom, as I did, and at the end of that time, you're still being bowled over by new things that you find out about young people and their learning, because every class is different. Every young person thinks slightly differently, and they have, even within mathematics, they have different ways of thinking about it, and that's really exciting.
I'm really interested in what you said just there towards the end, that there are different ways of thinking, and people have different ways of thinking in maths. And I suppose that sort of challenges my perception of it, because maths is quite, it's quite a certain, constants and so on. And I'm just kind of wondering if you could maybe give us maybe an example from your own experience of how you've seen young people bring a different kind of thinking to a situation or a problem, but arrive at the same outcome.
Okay, so any primary teacher will tell you that one of the key concepts that children meet in primary school and that is difficult to grasp is that of a fraction. And one of the reasons it's difficult to grasp is that fractions mean a whole host of different things. So they might mean part of a whole, or they might mean you're going to have part of a pile of lots of things. They might mean a number by themselves. They might mean 2/3 of something, a kind of operator. And you probably remember from your school days, you did work at one stage with equivalent fractions. So fractions which represent the same proportion of a whole, maybe, but look very different. So instead of 2/3, you might describe that proportion as 4/6 or 8/12 or whatever. And those are really hard ideas, and they're also linked with other hard ideas that children meet in primary school and carry on developing for years and years. So decimals and percentages and ratios, I mean, they're all closely tied up in this kind of densely connected world of mathematics. So it's no surprise that children find them demanding, and teachers find them demanding, because ideally you would plan around teaching for all those different aspects and then support children in making the links between them. I mean, that's kind of demanding. But I remember very, very vividly one GCSE retake class that I had. So we have this bizarre policy in this country that young people who have failed to achieve at a certain level in GCSE at age 16 essentially are pushed into retaking until they meet that magic level, which is currently labelled a grade 4. So that's not an easy position for 16, 17, 18-year-olds to be in. But I remember one such class where we were working with fractions, and I was trying to help these poor teenagers make sense of fractions rather than concentrating on what they had to do. What does it mean? Yeah, adults talk about fractions. They understand them. They use them. So how can we make sense of them? And I remember one girl was very quiet through a lesson that we were having. It was about putting fractions together. And one of the reasons that we work with equivalent fractions is that if you want to put fractions together, if you have a half and 2/3 of something, if you want to know how much you've got all together, you need to describe them as the same sort of fractions. And at the end of the lesson, she came up to me, and this is absolutely typical of girls in that they often won't want to ask something in the middle of a lesson, but they'll look out for a quiet time when they can ask. So she was actually working with 2/3. And she said, so instead of 2/3, I could actually think of 4/6, and it would mean the same sort of amount. It's just pieces cut up smaller. That's right, I said. But it's not just 4/6, she said. So I could think of it as 6/6/6/9. Yeah. Or I could think of it, and she got out her book, and she got a whole list of these equivalent fractions, each of which was kind of 2/3 of the whole, but a different way of thinking of it. And she said, but as far as I can see, this list could go on and on. I could fill up my whole book with a list of fractions like this. Yeah, that's right, I said. Interesting, isn't it? So she said, I think it's pretty cool, she said. So it just goes on and on. And I could do that for any fraction. And you said that people have been doing this for loads of years. How cool is that? I found that's really quite moving, I think, and quite profound.
It's an interesting example of something, a way in which what we kind of do in the classroom can sort of connect you with almost. This sounds a bit maybe over the top, but it can connect you with history, can't it? I mean, where maths is one of the the oldest disciplines that we have.
It connects you with part of what it means to be human and human activity that goes back thousands of years. And that's really important for our identity.
So, Jenny, you've been thinking about what a curriculum for the future might look like. So, can you talk us through some of the key features of a maths curriculum for the 21st century?
I think the first thing to say is that my work in recent years has been quite close to classrooms. It's been research which is about how curriculum is played out in the classroom. So not only what do teachers interpret what they're supposed to teach as, but what do students actually learn? And we're still in a position where, for a variety of reasons, our young people aren't making sense of the curriculum that they're presented with. So my first and central thinking about this really is that the education that we give young people has got to move beyond being able to do procedures and find answers to standard sort of questions. They've got to be able to make sense of the knowledge that they're learning, the skills that they're learning, and that means relating those to their experiences outside school, but also bringing to those experiences something additional. That's really important. Education can give them more than they can get from their family and immediate environment. But what they need changes with time. So, in terms of qualification, Biester's knowledge, skills, dispositions, actually, most people don't need to be able to do long division for themselves these days. They mostly don't need to be able to add up long columns of numbers for themselves. But they do need to understand how numbers work. They do need to understand how to work out estimates of what they want. They do need to understand the nature of compound interest and how taking out a loan at 15% interest or 20% interest rapidly gets out of control. Those sorts of things. What they need to have as knowledge and skills is changing as technology changes. In terms of socialization, so the culturally acceptable ways of being, those probably change more slowly. But there are also new issues that need to be addressed, not unconnected with technology. How should we behave in a world which is so social media connected? What are the ethics of artificial intelligence, or what we can do medically? Those sort of things. Because we can do it, does that mean that it's right to do it? In terms of the whole young person, so their subjectification, their development as a mature human being, some of those same issues probably threaten that. So this constant exposure to the media without having to take responsibility for what you've done always, those sorts of things can chip away at the health of the individual human. So those are all issues which we as a society need to address, and our chief tool for that is our education system in response to what wider society feeds into that. So I am really interested in how what schools set out to do in the future should look like, what schools should look like. But I also think that there's a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So if you read think pieces about the curriculum for the future in terms of maths, they'll often say, well, who needs times tables for the 21st century? Who needs calculus for the 21st century? Who needs fractions for the 21st century? Who needs trigonometry for the 21st century? And it's very easy just to look at the surface of the specifics that you think you learnt at school without digging underneath and seeing how those might have supported your number sense, your growing sense of ratio and proportion. So proportional thinking is really important for all sorts of purposes in the modern world. And there are also questions of what we need in terms of specialized knowledge. So yes, we can program computers to do all sorts of things, but who understands what it is that they're doing and the limitations to that? Who's going to analyze that? Who's going to understand the unanticipated consequences of that? And who needs the education for that? So there are issues around what does everybody need and what do just some people need, and who decides and when? And those are really very complex questions.
Let's kind of sort of jump 10 years into the future, shall we? Not too far forward. What the maths classroom might look like 10 years from now. Is it much different to how it is now? I was quite interested in what you were saying, Jenny, this, in relation to who needs to know what, up against a future where your technology and things are advancing all the time, and we might even kind of say we don't understand what we already have in relation to some things. I just wondered whether there's anything in that might be worth exploring.
Yeah, we're not very good at looking forward, are we? I mean, you probably don't remember, but in the 80s there was a big debate about the schools of the future. Children would be, by 2000, children would be learning at home from their computers. We wouldn't need teachers. So when did we have a serious experiment with that? About March 2020. And what did we find? Well, I mean, apart from the fact that we weren't prepared in terms of hardware and internet connections and so on, we actually had brought home to us the very real limitations of that, for not just for learning the curriculum, but in terms of young people's development and people's mental health and so on. So if we look forward 10 years, I would like to see a broader maths education. So one which needs knowledge to think with, but where the making sense of that knowledge has priority, where young people learn to engage with some of the different balances of mathematical thinking that we need going forward, which certainly will include more fluent, informed, confident dealing with data, confidence to interrogate it, to make sense of it, and to call it out when sense is not being made. And connected with that, education that includes for computational thinking. But as I say, I do think that we need to be careful not to throw out the core empowering mathematical ideas that we already have in the classroom just because we don't obviously use them every day, because they do inform our much wider thinking and functioning as social human beings.
So, with that in mind, Jenny, how do we prepare teachers for teaching that curriculum for the future?
Well, yeah, that's a fairly $1 million question, because I mean, if we look at, you probably remember we had a new curriculum for most school students in 2014, and one of the things that that curriculum promoted, particularly in maths and science, was a bigger role for developing reasoning and for developing problem solving. So a downplayed role for core facts, for the sorts of reasons that we've talked about. And I've spent the last 6 years at IOE researching what teachers make of that, how they actually interpret it, how they come to be able to work with those new emphases. And it is very, very difficult. So that's not a radical rethinking of the curriculum. Those are ideas which have been in the curriculum for many years. It's just a re-emphasis, but it requires very subject knowledgeable, kind of deep knowledge of the subject at the primary school level or the secondary school level to be able to do that well. And it requires all sorts of other things, including a professional sort of community that's operating reasonably successfully. So if I then say I would like to see the maths curriculum and related areas develop so that students learn to think rather better computationally, and so that students are able to engage with data, so that they become literate with data and they can engage with ideas around artificial intelligence and putting all these things together. That's talking very complex teaching, enormously complex teaching and teacher development. But we are beginning, I think, through the experiences forced on us in 2020, we are beginning to engage more actively and at a bigger scale with ways in which we can use blended learning. So bring the experts into the classroom, interact with the experts in that way, with the teacher learning as well as the students learning, those sorts of ideas. But you can see it's a massive field, and the related issues are so complex, from the really quite theoretical, what should be in the curriculum, what knowledge is needed for that, to, well, how do we make small steps in this direction in real classrooms across the country, across the world? And those sorts of issues are the sorts of things that we're hoping to pick up as we move forward with our book series. So a variety of thinking around how we get from where we are to where we think would be a better place for educating our young people for an uncertain, probably rapidly changing, different future in which we still want them to thrive as human beings.
Jennie, it's been great to talk with you today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. You can find and follow Jennie on Twitter at Jennie Maths. That's Jennie with an IE. As ever, there are links to our guest work on the IOE website contained in the episode notes, and also check the notes to find out how you can contribute to the book series that Jennie mentioned. We're always keen to hear which topics and guests you'd like to hear on the podcast, so we're running a very short feedback survey to collect your ideas. The link is in the episode notes. Do have your say. We'd love to hear from you. Our back catalogue and our Spotify playlist of songs chosen by our guests and the podcast team are all available via our UCL webpage. Just search Research for the Real World. And finally, I'm packing up my pillow fort studio and stepping back from the podcast for the foreseeable. So just a very big thank you from me for your company over these first 7 seasons. I hope you continue to enjoy listening to the podcast as much as I have done making it. I'm Rob Webster. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.